MPs return to Ottawa this week for what's expected to be a busy legislative session as Mark Carney's Liberals look to make headway on its lofty agenda. But with big ideas can come issues around execution, politics, and how to pay for it all. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post politics writer Simon Tuck joins me to discuss Carney's priorities for the fall, how the government hopes to implement some of its agenda, and whether there could be any surprises. Don't forget you can find this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, everywhere else you get your podcasts. Hope you can leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So Simon, it seems like a long time since the Liberals under Mark Carney won election in the spring, but it's actually just been a few short months. Parliament returned this week, and we can talk about the plan going forward, but I do want to step back a little bit and just remind Canadians, remind listeners about the mood of this government post-election. Like, where was the government at, and what was Mark Carney saying he was going to do after he won in the spring?
Well, I think the mood among many Liberals, both those who were elected or re-elected in April and the people who work on the Hill, the people around the Liberal government, was one of relief after they came back from up to 25 points down in the polls just a few months before the election to almost miraculously win a fourth mandate from Canadians. So that, they were able to pull that amazing trick that others had tried to do in the past, but had failed, where you are a government that's been around a while, and many Canadians are seeing you as perhaps a little tired, out of ideas, maybe even a little feeling a little entitled. And so you change leaders, and usually it doesn't work. And I'm thinking back in the day when the first Trudeau government, talking about Pierre Trudeau, switched leaders to John Turner, and there was a bit of a excitement among Canadians with a new guy who was more business oriented. And then the election came around, and he got trounced by Brian Mulroney. Mm-hmm. And then 8 years later, after 2 terms of Mulroney, the Conservatives were, like their predecessors, looking pretty tired and down in the polls. And so they switched leaders to Kim Campbell, who definitely was a fresh face and seemed to have some different ideas. And Canadians, again, rejected that idea and seemed to be saying in both cases, we're not fooled by this trick. And yet this time, for whatever reason, when the Liberals switched from Justin Trudeau to Mark Carney, it worked. And so I think a lot of Liberals were thrilled to be back in government.
Yeah, and very much, I think, in some ways surprised a lot of Canadians, although there were, I think, some people that kind of came to the conclusion that perhaps it was the leader was the problem, less so the party. And there's still many others who feel like that Donald Trump played an outsized factor in the election. And, at the time, because of that, I feel like it felt very much like the country was really ready to rally behind the government and the new prime minister, and that they were very supportive of some of his promised changes. And I'm curious, from your perspective, do we get a sense that those changes materialized, and are Canadians still as supportive of this government and its agenda as it was when they got elected?
Well, a couple of pieces to chew on there. I would say that Canadians were definitely impressed with the new mood, the energy, and the ambition of the Carney government in the first few months. And going back to the election, it was pretty clear from what pollsters were telling us that Canadians, at the end of the day, in this most recent election in April, Canadians largely chose Mark Carney over Pierre Poilievre because they viewed him as the better choice, the better option to deal with the Trump tariffs. For whatever reason, his resume, his personality could be a wide range of things. And there could be, probably was a Poilievre factor as well, that some Canadians didn't view him as a career politician, as the best option for their interests in that regard. Now, a few months later, it seems that Canadians still, again, going by the polls, Canadians are still largely supportive of this government. They won the popular vote in the election by only just a little over 2%. And now, in some polls, they're up by more than that, up to 6 or 7%. Yet, if you dig a little deeper in the numbers, what we see is that more Canadians are dissatisfied with the government and fewer are satisfied, which seems like a contradiction to the fact that they're up in the polls in terms of who would you support if there was an election. But to me, it just shows that Canadians were happy with the energy and the ambition, and now they want to see some results. Now, when the major things on the agenda are, by definition, long-term fixes, and I'm thinking of things like, the ports and the railways and the pipelines that are, what they're calling the big projects. And I'm also thinking of, the housing crisis that we see in so many cities and even smaller communities across the country. Everyone's aware you're not going to get a fix on those things in a few months. But I think what people want to see, and the government's very aware of this, they want to at least see tangible progress. They want to see some plans coming together, something beyond rhetoric, where they can sign on and say, okay, I buy into this plan and I think that you're on the right track.
Yeah. And there'd been a lot of talk in the last few months about fixing some things in Canada, fixing internal trade and allowing provinces to do business with one another with less red tape. There was talk about fixing our economy to get us better access to other markets because we were so dependent on the United States. And then there was a lot of talk about the trade relationship with the United States. And the Liberals, they met just last week in Edmonton, and coming out of that, there was this list of mega projects and this idea that we're going to supercharge the Canadian economy. Are we starting to see some of those tangible announcements, or are we still dealing with a lot of the rhetoric here? And I guess further to that, how do those big ideas impact the Liberals' priorities in the immediate term in a legislative session?
Yeah, well, there's no question that the big projects, and as you mentioned, there's been 5 that have been publicly identified as likely to be getting the green light. There's no question that those big projects, or the notion of big projects anyway, is an important part of this government's agenda, and one of the reasons they were elected. So I think they're very aware they need to show progress on that, and they've, in fairness, they have. It's only been a few months, and they've made some moves, and it's got to be pointed out that these are not just government projects. For the most part, they're projects where the government would approve them, and in some cases provide some financial support. But it's mostly the private sector that's going to be building things like pipelines or even ports to some degree. One of the big criticisms of the Trudeau government, and you could even go further back and say Canadian governments in general in recent decades, is that there's just been a lack of emphasis on infrastructure, whether it's big infrastructure like these big projects that we're talking about, or on a smaller scale, like if you speak to people in the housing industry or analysts who cover these things, they'll say the lack of infrastructure at the local level on things like sewers and electricity and water is one of the things that makes it so difficult to build houses in this country, and secondly, what that lack of supply means for prices, which is what a lot of people are concerned about, whether you're someone who wants to move up and buy a house, or if you're someone who's just maybe you're going to university or college and you just want to live fairly near campus and have decent rent. It's a supply and demand thing.
We'll be right back.
Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contracts. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
As we look to fix some of those big problems in Canada, like where do the Liberals go in the next 100 days? Do we get a sense of what this legislative session will look like for the Liberals, and even, how they navigate the position that they're in politically when we're talking about a minority parliament? We don't have a supply and confidence agreement with the NDP, and they'll need to find ways to get wins.
That's right. And Carney's listed 7 priorities, and they're big ones: affordability, housing, economic unification. You mentioned interprovincial free trade, sovereignty, which could mean a number of things, trade partnerships, fiscal restraint, and immigration. Well, those are huge topics. You're going to have to pick off some smaller things to get some wins. And I think they're going to try to do that. And they've already talked about the big 5 projects that they appear to be giving the green light to. And then there's smaller things like the bail laws. They're going to try to bring in stricter bail laws, I'm confident in saying. And that's an interesting one because it sort of is another thing that they are, what conservatives would say, is lifting from the conservative agenda. The danger is that they get bogged down, I think, in the usual things that often bog down governments, whether it's dealing with the bureaucracy or just a lack of courage in taking on critics, other levels of government, including First Nations. The public mood, of course, is always a factor. And of course, the wild card in almost all of these things, Dave, is the economy.
Yeah.
Some of the numbers do not look good. We've got this major trade, I was going to say irritant, but of course it's much more than that, with the US. And if these things lead to a recession, which is far from an impossibility from what I can see, then that affects everything from your ability to fund big projects to your ability to keep your fiscal house in order, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be the real game changer.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's kind of come up with the Liberal government is the question of how are you going to pay for all the promises you've already made, and let alone any commitments you make going forward? There's been discussion of increasing our defense spending so we can meet our NATO requirements. There's, as you mentioned, any number of things. There's housing projects, there's major infrastructure projects, there's affordability measures for Canadians. How has the government suggested they're going to pay for everything? And how will that play out this fall?
Well, that's a big question for sure. And, my sense is they're going to need to pull off a real push and pull trick where they're both with one arm, they're going to be investing lots of money in all these things that we've mentioned, housing, infrastructure, etc., expensive things, not to mention a massive increase in defense spending to get to the NATO target of 2% of GDP. And meanwhile, on the other hand, one of their priorities, as we just mentioned, is fiscal responsibility. Well, it's not looking like it's going to be a very responsible first year for the Carney government, with projections of a deficit of $92 billion. And I realize numbers like that, whether you say 20 billion, 40 billion, 140 billion, these numbers are quite abstract for most people. But to give it some context, a $92 billion deficit would be the second largest in Canadian history, topped only by Justin Trudeau's 2020-21 budget that was many times that during the pandemic. So, one of Carney's attributes, and one of the things I think he was elected, one of the reasons he was elected, was because of his reputation and his resume as an internationally rounded economist. So a massive deficit like that does not look good on him. Now, admittedly, you have to spend some money to do all these big things they want to do. And they are going to try to they're going to try to get a certain amount of that money from cutting costs within government, within the bureaucracy, and perhaps some programs. But it's not going to be an easy trick to pull.
And as you mentioned, a lot of this is tied into the economy and Canada's economic fortunes. And as we all know, they're very tied into the global economy and specifically our relationship with the US. Do we anticipate to see movement on trade talks with the United States? I know that it's kind of been hit or miss with the Trump administration, and a lot of people are wondering, where Canada stands in all of that, whether it's tariffs, whether it's a new free trade agreement with the US or with the US and Mexico. Do we expect anything to come this fall on that file?
Well, it's a mystery at this point, Dave. To be honest, there's no doubt that that is a priority, probably the number one priority for the federal government is to get a deal with the US. But there are different thoughts, different theories on what the Canadian strategy is. Some even think that with the US tariffs mostly focused on a few sectors, namely aluminum, steel, forest products, autos, that Canada has a pretty good deal in comparison to international comparables already. So maybe we're not doing so badly. That's one school of thought. Another is that this is Canadian strategy to wait it out, that we might get a better deal because they've already blown through three deadlines that they set for getting a deal. And so maybe the Canadian strategy is to wait it out and hope that things like inflation make Trump and his government keener to get a deal with Canada. So, well, it's going to be a really interesting few months coming up on that front. There's been a lot of talk, both within government and outside government, about the importance of Canada diversifying its trade. And let's just say it's a lot easier to say than it is to do. There are reasons why manufacturers in Europe, for example, use steel from Korea or from within Europe. And it's just because a Canadian steelmaker loses some access to the US market doesn't mean that it's just going to go, hey, we have extra steel and be able to sell it somewhere. It's easier said than done. And that's just, one example of the challenges that you face in trying to diversify trade, in that geographical proximity is one of the keys to being able to export stuff and sell stuff throughout the world. So, that will be something that Canadian officials will work hard on for sure. But we've been hearing about the importance of trade diversification literally since before Confederation. So it's more talk than anything at this point. The Canadian officials are well aware we need access to the U.S. market.
And lastly, I know you mentioned it earlier when you talk about the Conservatives accusing the Liberals of lifting from their playbook. There's the to and fro of politics in Ottawa, especially in a minority parliament situation where you have a pretty feisty Conservative leader. He's re-energized. He's back in Parliament after having won a by-election in Alberta after losing a seat in the general election. What does Pierre Poilievre do when it comes to pressure on Carney? How do the issues that the Conservatives have been pushing take focus off of the Liberals' agenda? Or do they allow the Liberals some freedom to, as you said, lift policies from the Conservative playbook and adopt them as their own and score some points with voters who may not exactly be on their side normally?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out, first of all, that this is not just an important parliamentary session and few months coming up for the Liberal government. This is a very important time in history for Pierre Poilievre as well. As you mentioned, he won a by-election in Alberta, so he's back in Parliament after what I got to believe was a humiliating defeat, not just at the national level as leader, but as an MP for an Ottawa area riding. And, he said he attributed that to the fact that he was honest in saying that government cuts were necessary, and then that wasn't popular in his Ottawa area riding. Perhaps. But, it's going to be interesting to see if he comes back diminished. And let's not forget, he's facing a leadership review in January. And while no high-profile rivals have popped up yet, you never know. And he would certainly want a resounding win in that leadership review. And his big challenge, of course, is that while he's very popular within the Conservative Party, it remains to be seen how popular he is or will be in the future among Canadians in general. So both the Conservatives and the Liberals have a lot to play for in the coming few months.
So looking ahead to the session this fall, Are there any surprises or anything Canadians should keep their eye out for that you think might catch them by surprise?
Well, these are not predictions, but these are things I would describe as possibilities. And the frame, of course, is that we have this massive fiscal deficit coming, and there's also all these big plans, many of which require lots of spending. So one of the ways you could, or the government could reduce that gap between those two things is, and people don't want to hear this, but you could raise the GST. And tax policy experts will always say you want to tax things that are less harmful and not tax things that are really good. Well, we don't have a consumption problem. So taxing the GST would be less harmful than raising funds in almost any other way. Another thing that I would say is possible is government's talked a lot about cutting costs from within the bureaucracy. There could be more to come, and there could be some high-profile stuff that we could see, such as perhaps folding two departments together or cutting a couple of programs, maybe something that people are quite familiar with. Another thing that is just something, again, that's possible. And again, people don't want to hear about cuts to federal transfers to provinces and territories because that leads to spending on health and education, things that really hit home in our communities. But that's got to be on the table, given this huge fiscal problem that we have. And it could also be used by the federal government as leverage when they're discussing interprovincial free trade, because lots of provinces just don't want to do it. They want everyone else to do it, but they don't want to give up their own little protectionist operations. So another thing we might be on the lookout for is supply management, which is very popular in the province of Quebec, but it's on the radar of the Trump administration. And so if we're trying to get them to reduce their protectionism, it seems natural to me that they are not going to stand too long with Canada protecting poultry, dairy, and other supply management industries. And they might even have some other industries on their radar, like Canadian Airlines. They might want better access there too. So another thing that we could keep our eye out for is the fact that the government could inflict retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. There's been a lot of talk about it. Proponents such as Ontario Premier Doug Ford have said, come on, guys, I thought our elbows were up. And some critics, including those within the Liberal caucus, have said elbows are down. So we'll see.
Certainly a lot to keep an eye out for as politicians return to Ottawa this week. Simon, pleasure talking to you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Dave.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Simon Tuck. More from him at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.